Hello, my name is Gary Kleppel. I'm Emeritus Professor of Biology at the State University of New York um, at Albany. And along with my wife and co-author Pam Kleppel, am co-owner and operator of a small sheep and poultry farm about 15 miles west of the city of Albany. Today we're going to talk about meat. So for thousands of millennia, herbivores, particularly large herd-forming ungulates, have been central to the fertility of the Earth's soils and to the functioning of its ecosystems. Animal protein has nourished our species and sustained our civilizations for thousands of years. Even today, meat consumption is increasing worldwide. In short, we love meat. So perhaps it's interesting that for the past few decades, there has been an increasing appeal, often from reputable sources, that we curtail our consumption of meat because meat is no good for us and it's no good for the planet. From my research and from Pam and my practical experience as farmers, we believe that the situation is a bit more complicated. And today I'm going to address an hypothesis that suggests that agricultural practices determine the effects of meat production and consumption on human and environmental health. In other words, the hypothesis that we're going to examine today is that the way meat is produced influences its effect on human and environmental health. So before I can really address the hypothesis, I want to just provide a sort of a primer on agricultural thinking, agricultural models and practices. And agriculture exists along a continuum of practices. At the extreme are two very different models. One is the industrial model of agriculture and the other is regenerative model. Industrial agriculture emphasizes production. How much can I produce, how quickly, and how cheaply? In order to do that, I need to be specialized, and monocultures is a mainstay of the industrial model. Usually, it's necessary to practice production at very large scales, thousands of acres. There's an intensive use of inputs, inputs being things like synthetic fertilizers, pesticides. Animal agriculture in the industrial system makes extensive use of grains and other growth stimulants such as hormones and submedicinal levels of antibiotics. And confinement, either for part or the entire life of the animal, is a major part of the industrial model. Regenerative agriculture is very different. While production is important, environmental stewardship is at least as important as production. Diversification of what's produced is also very important. So instead of one product, multiple kinds of organisms or plants and animals, crops and livestock are produced, usually at small to medium scales, let's say less than 1,000 acres. Input use is reduced or absolutely not employed. Pasture-based practices, the grass-fed approach or the pasture-based approach for poultry and swine are key to regenerative practice. And confinement is either eliminated or minimal. So let's look specifically at how animals are produced in the industrial and regenerative systems. The industrial system uses what has become known in the literature as conventional livestock management. Livestock are present or stocked at low densities and moved infrequently. So this pasture with just a few cows on it, maybe a ton of live weight per acre, is typical of the conventional model of livestock management. The animals will probably be here for weeks, even up to the entire season. They won't be moved to a new pasture, and that will lead to overgrazing. and that will require supplementation, but even before supplementation with grain or other products such as haylage or baleage is used, the animals, before before they overgraze, animals will be supplemented with grain or other products. Some animals will spend their entire lives in confinement. We've all heard of battery box chickens. We've heard of factory farms where swine are raised. Those are confinement for most or all of the animals' lives. For beef cattle and other ruminants, the animals will be raised on pasture for about 6 months or so, and then move to a confined animal feeding operation, or CAFO, which is also known as a feedlot, where it will probably receive a hormonal implant in its ear and be put on a diet of high energy grains, supplemented with some submedicinal antibiotics, all of which are intended to increase the growth rate so that we get the animal out of the system and into the food supply within 12 months. Regenerative agriculture is very different. The regenerative farmer seeks to mimic the wild grazing ecosystem. This picture of bison is typical of the model that we mimic in regenerative agriculture. So you notice the bison are aggregated at much higher concentrations than you saw in that picture of the cattle, the beef cattle. And what you don't see, but is happening, is that these animals are constantly moving, or nearly constantly moving, in response to stimuli in the environment. So they're constantly moving and aggregated at relatively high densities. The regenerative farmer seeks to mimic those behaviors or those characteristics using what's called a suite of techniques that are together called multi-paddock or adaptive multi-paddock management, in which high stock densities and frequent rotation are commonly used. So this is some sheep. They're actually present at about 3 to 5 tons of live weight, as opposed to those cows, which are about a ton of live weight per acre. These are 3 to 5 tons of live weight per acre. They are surrounded by a lightweight electrical fence that can be moved every day. And so the pasture has been divided into paddocks. And what it looks like in this picture is that there are fences everywhere. In fact, this is just a map showing where the animals will be moved over a period of time. And this fence is just taken out and moved from one paddock to another. So at any time, 94% of that pasture is resting and only 6% is being grazed. So let's look at the concerns about eating and producing meat. I'm going to talk about two concerns, and I don't have time to give a complete and very detailed explanation of or examination of the range of concerns of this concern, but I'm going to look at some of the infection risks and also some of the nutritional aspects of eating meat. So this is a figure from a paper by Diaz-Gonzalez et al., published in 1998 in Science, and it shows that E. coli O157H7, a pathogenic E. coli, it's an acidophile. It lives in the digestive system of ungulates, and it is and animals and it causes hemorrhagic diarrhea. It's a very dangerous pathogen. And Diaz-Gonzalez et al. Clearly show that the presence of E. coli 157H7 in pasture-raised beef is much lower than in grain-fed beef. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or representative of a whole group of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, first emerged in hospitals that were overusing antibiotics, and in factory farms, particularly swine operations, where animals are confined and present in very, very large numbers. So that obviously in a situation like this, animals are going to be sick all the time, and they have to be medicated to be kept alive. And this has been what sort of the breeding ground for the evolution of antibiotic resistance. Interesting, in a paper by Smith, she reports that antibiotic-resistant bacteria, methicillin, MRSA bacteria, have never been reported in pastured swine. If we look at some of the attributes of nutritional attributes of grass-fed versus grain-fed animals, and I just had time to look at, let's say, beef, which has been well studied, we see that grass-fed beef never receive, grass-fed cattle never receive hormonal supplements, whereas grain-fed animals always receive grain-fed, or almost always receive hormonal supplements. Grass-fed animals grass-fed meat contains about an order of magnitude more beta-carotene, which is important for vitamin A production and for the production of several antioxidants. Vitamin A is 5 times more abundant in grass-fed and grain-fed beef. Alpha tocopherols, 2.5 to 4.5 times more abundant. Total fat is about a quarter of as concentrated, present in about a quarter of as present as in grain-fed meat. If we look at omega-3 fatty acids, we see that as we bring animals in, the beef cattle in from pasture, the omega-3 fatty acid content declines markedly. Omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is the ratio of the omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, which is becoming increasingly used as an indicator of a healthy food, is at about 1-to-1 in grass-fed beef, and the experts suggest that's where it should be. In grain-fed beef, it's frequently higher than 4-to-1, 4 times as much omega-6. And omega-6 are the sort of precursors to the bad cholesterols, low-density lipids. Conjugated linoleic acids are a group of 28 omega-6 fatty acids that are sort of controversial, but there's some evidence that they are important in weight control, in diabetes control, and possibly even cancer control, or reducing the risk of cancer. And they tend to be much more abundant in grass-fed meat than in grain-fed meat, about 3 times on average. And this data is from a paper by Daly. A number of papers recently have reported on the importance of reducing red meat consumption because, and quite honestly, those papers sort of, they rarely mention the difference between grass-fed and grain-fed products. And yet we see that these are almost coming from different species. So, you know, comments by the Eat Lancet Commission that we should reduce our red meat consumption by 50 to 60% really doesn't capture the difference between different kinds of red meat of the same species. I personally prefer the comments of Provenza et al. In a paper recently published in Frontiers in Nutrition, where they say health is enhanced when livestock forage on phytochemically rich landscapes is reduced when livestock forage on simple mixture or monoculture pastures or consume high grain rations in feedlots, and is greatly reduced for people who eat highly processed diets. That really captures, in my opinion, the importance of the production methods and how that influences the healthfulness of a food product. Let's look at the second concern, that meat production is wrecking the planet, that meat production is damaging to the planet. At the very base of the production system is the pasture and the microbial biome that lives in the soil, that is capturing carbon, that is turning over nutrients, making them available to plants, stimulating plant growth, holding water in the soil, etc. Their microbes are incredibly important to the pastoral system. And so in this, the data presented here represent a study that I did in the Helderberg Mountains of upstate New York. And I looked at 21 farms and 21 pastures in the Helderbergs, some managed by multi-paddock, that is regenerative techniques, some by conventional industrial techniques, and some that were just cut as for hay. And I'm looking at the microbes in the soil, and in the multi-paddock system, microbial biomass was significantly higher than in the other systems, the other kinds of soil, or soils from other management systems. The fungal to bacterial biomass, without going into detail, the fungal to bacterial biomass is a measure of the stability of the soil ecosystem. And the fungal to bacterial biomass is higher in the multi-paddock system than in either of the other two systems. Microbial functional diversity, which, as we know, diversity is also associated with stability and functioning of the ecosystem, again, significantly higher in the multi-paddock system. If we look at plant species, plant biodiversity, the forage, more kinds of plants in an unmanaged pasture where plants were just allowed to grow wild. In a multi-paddock pasture, there were more kinds of plants than in a conventional or ungrazed pasture. If we look at grassland breeding birds, multi-paddock operations, that is regenerative beef cattle operations, had higher grassland breeding bird abundances than either continuously grazed pastures or pastures where the livestock were minimally rotated every so often. If we look at nutrient runoff and leaching, total runoff and runoff of nutrients was also lower. And this is a study in Texas, which, by the way, another group in Texas did the same experiments that I just mentioned, using different techniques. So different place, different techniques, and we came up with the same results. And here, nutrient runoff and leaching are reduced using regenerative multi-paddock techniques. Agriculture is blue water intensive, and this is from a paper that I published just recently in Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, and we see that where I was able to use USDA data to look at where the water use, the most water use occurs in these operations, and I found that it's clearly in feed production of grains and hay. And when you remove the grains, you actually reduce production of grains for feed. You reduce the amount of water required by about 2/3. And I also had the opportunity to look at regenerative and industrial production of beef cattle and the greenhouse gas emissions that they produce. And again, greenhouse gas emissions are about 35% lower in the regenerative system. So in summary, there's evidence that pasture-based meat poses a lower risk of infection and is nutritionally superior to industrially produced meat. And secondly, regenerative pasture-based livestock production appears to be potentially benign, environmentally benign relative to conventional industrial production. So if we again look at our hypothesis, we see we have support for the hypothesis that the way meat is produced influences its effect on human and environmental health. In other words, it's how, not who. Thank you very much.